Are you willing to accept Christ's invitation to know Him more intimately, love Him more intensely, and follow Him more closely, and then go out into the world and live His good news? If you say yes, then you could be the 13th apostle. Join Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey, the odd couple of Catholic radio, as they ride the radio waves 2 by 2 to share the goodness, beauty, and truth of Jesus Christ and His church. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the 13th apostle.
The Pharisees taught, "You shall not hate any of your kindred in your heart. Reprove your neighbor openly so that you do not incur sin because of that person. Take no revenge and cherish no grudge against your own people. You shall love your neighbor, but only your neighbor." Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the 13th Apostle, where we explore the good, beautiful, and true of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church. This is part 2 with, Dan, jump in, my co-host.
Yeah, sure. Here I go. Both feet. We're here with Deacon Chuck Kelly once again and our dear friend Jim Mulvihill. We had a really super, energized ending to our last episode last Saturday when it was aired. When we got off the air, Deacon Chuck Kelly jumped in with some pretty cool stuff. And we decided to go with that second episode. Deacon Chuck, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you remember where you left us off? Because you're rolling into something real good.
Yeah, I think we were transitioning from this thought of combat and a common enemy and how that relates to patriotism. And then how does that translate to the Christian life, right? And that, one of my thoughts is that the problem isn't patriotism or another human problem, that it's our broken hearts. It's always been our broken hearts. And the conflict that I think Tom was picking at is not an external conflict, it's an internal one. And that's always at play. And it's so good to have, Tom, you were saying some things about we're facing Christ alone, but not yet. We're here together, and steel sharpens steel. And having friends that are both men, not just men, but gentlemen. And what is a gentleman? Good men with good things to say, and steel sharpens steel. So there's the combat. There's our real patriotism for our true homeland, which is heaven. And I think that's kind of where we start to shift gears now from a natural challenge to a supernatural challenge.
We have to be careful with that. This idea of going to heaven. So much of what Jesus talks about. In fact, maybe you could infer that when he talks about the mansion has many rooms. But his emphasis was not in leaving Earth to get to heaven. We're not going to get on that supersonic head north. It was all about conversion here on earth. The kingdom of God is at hand. In the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Revelation, heaven and earth are meeting. Every Mass, we talked about, Dan and I talked about this, I think this was it was last week, Danny, when we interviewed Michelle Segarino of Cross Catholic Outreach. That the coming together of heaven and earth to build God's kingdom on earth. And Deacon Chuck, as you just said, you pulled back a little bit on the standing before God, and we're not there yet. But as Jim has said so many times, and the three of us know why he would say this, that moment could come like that. When we may not live our biblical 70 or whatever. Well, actually, one of us has.
Thanks, Tom.
But that's not your life expectancy, though. Your life expectancy is you got at least 10 years, 11 years.
I'm coming, Wheezy.
Here comes the big one.
So it's the point I was making toward the end of the last episode was Are we going to keep going along? We call ourselves Christians. Each of us calls himself a Christian. What does that mean? How are we being agents of change the way Christ calls us to, as opposed to doing the same old, same old? Okay, we're going to have a conflict. We're patriots. We're going to be in this war. We're going to be in this conflict. We're in Afghanistan for 20 years. The treasure that was lost, that was in that conflict. And obviously there's libraries of discussion on debates on Afghanistan. Well, there will be on Afghanistan, on Vietnam, and going back to history, we talked about the Fourth Crusade. Books on that. Are we going to keep doing the same old, same old? Are we going to reinforce the phrase that human history is a timeline of conflict with brief periods of peace, and never all at once throughout the world? So what is it? What are we supposed to do? Rah, rah, let's go to war. I'm going to battle this guy. This person offended me. How are we supposed to turn the other cheek? I know this is tough. It's tough for me. It's tougher for you guys, I'm sure. That's with your personalities. I don't want to go. I don't want to just do what we've been doing. Our church has lost its way in many regards. So I don't want to do that anymore.
That's part of I think that's part of the problem, is that it appears in some respects that our church has lost its way. So there's no definitive direction. There's no definitive. I don't want to insult the Pope too much. There's no definitive leadership, and there's really, who do you look to? I mean, Christ, of course, but here, who do you look to? You said, are we going to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again? Unfortunately, you're dealing with human nature. People tend not, most people tend not to learn from their mistakes. Most people tend to make the same mistake over and over and over again, and then wonder why. As Einstein said, you're expecting different results, but you keep doing the same stupid thing over and over and over again. There's a saying, past is prologue. It's tough. It's a tough time, and it's a tough time I think, in human history. It really is. In our civilization, it's a tough time. We're under assault from just about every direction, including internally.
But Jim, the contrast with the early Christians, they've got emperors who are sending them to the lions.
No, I know.
Making human torches out of them.
I know.
Again, with our episode on Constantine, it wasn't until the Edict of Milan where, okay, no more persecution of the Christians. In some way we've got it easy. We're called to be different, though. You say it's human nature, and I understand that absolutely. I know my human nature, but we're called to be different.
I'll tell you, Tom. I consciously, because I pointed this out to you in one of our texts or emails, that the older I get, the more I think about my past, my career, things I did. I consciously try to be better. It doesn't always work out that way. I still have a temper. I still have difficulties with people, but I try. And sometimes that's the best you can do for the time being. That's just me personally,
I think as I sit here and listen, I hear Tom say that we are called to be different. I see the same thing by saying we are called to take the narrow path. We are called to step away from all of that outside the path, which is much alike, and make decisions to flex our will in the spirit of the Beatitudes and put ourselves on that path. The revelation that you guys have made regarding war, and you're much more historian-like than I could ever be, plus I'm not a veteran, that we've always been in war, except, as Tom said, 3 times in the history of mankind. But I also know that my manhood, my heart, is no different than the heart of man for eons before me and the same as eons after me. And yes, surrounded by war. But it's within that wartime that we still have to stand up and stand for something. And that's what we need to find and fight for and strike those balances. And yes, we are going to see our Lord and we're going to stand before him by ourselves, but we're going to be the one cell of a body that we've been extracted from now to stand before him. And I think we're going to be judged on what kind of leaders we were when we were in the slop on earth. Did we lead men? Did we lead ourselves? And how did we do so? You know, Peter once again drew his sword, as I said in our last episode, and the sword he was rebuked for it, but yet he led the church. He's the foundation. He's the office of the church. He brought the organization to the church. Whereas Paul was killing Christians, murdering them, persecuting them, and he became kind of the soul and the energy of the church. So there's an incredible amount of inclusiveness that I like to say, and universality in the heart of man, whether there's war or no war, or whether you're boots on the ground, out front, downrange or not. I think we all have our battles. We all have our battles. I know we have our battles, but never, ever would I put myself in the shoes of Deacon Chuck. And if you allow me to say so, Deacon Chuck, and I know you will, even more so, Jim's boots. But yeah, the heart of man is the heart of man. And we'll be judged by the battles that we've chosen in accordance to what they stand for and where our hearts were when we fought them. That's what I believe.
Dan, you used the word fight. Jim, you've made that reference multiple times, the fight for faith. Deacon Chuck was steel sharpens steel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to discern, blessed are the peacemakers, in all these references of battle, of fighting is another word for conflict. You could be drawn into or surrounded by conflict. And I don't know. And again, take this out of military. I mean, it's got to be for everybody. This is everybody's life. There's conflict in everyone's life, as you said, Dan. So can you be so trained? I mean, you guys, I mean, when Dan, when you talk about football, even Jim to an extent, when you talk football, you know, I've said this to you, you know, it's like that. It's like your hand going into a well-worn glove. Same thing with you, Jim, in military. Once, you know, if we get onto either one of those subjects, you guys go, 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 go. It's like effortless. And just because that really was your training, you spent much more time in those respective endeavors, those fields, than you did. I'm not knocking you. This is just an observation. I could think of other things that I did more than, let's say, immersing yourself for 8 hours a day in sacred scripture or the sacraments or meditating and praying and whatnot. And I think that goes to, I don't know who said it, Jim, that you said it, human nature. You know, we got to make a living. So the rare few of us are in, let's say, Deacon Chuck's position, you know, where he's making a living immersed in the church. But there's only 50,000 priests in the United States, 320 million people. I don't know how many deacons there are. So, and obviously we know what Pope Benedict said about the laity stepping up. And we needed to have that call from Pope Benedict, but that call was there from the beginning. I mean, there was no church. There was no Vatican when Jesus was alive. It's just one person who lived differently. And forget about his divinity, okay? Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about as the man. Look what happened to him. And I was only half kidding, I don't know, a week or two ago. about Socrates, like in that Socratic method, and you'd keep asking, and look what happened to Socrates. People don't like being questioned, or whether it's having their motives questioned. I don't think Socrates was questioning anybody's motives. I think he was questioning that material. And again, I think Deacon Chuck, you said this, okay, and this is the common refrain, or maybe Dan, you said it. Okay, we hate the sin, we don't hate the sinner. Okay, yeah, that's a truth. I don't know how far back that goes, when that first entered the catechism. In the heat of the moment, I'd be shocked if somebody could say, or if God would end up saying, "Yep, you know what? All these cases, there was a split second where the person says, I love this guy." So holiness means to be set apart. That's what the word means in its translation. The setting apart was Jesus setting Peter apart with throwing down the sword. Peter was acting like probably each one of us would act if in defense of someone we love. I saw a debate, I don't know, several months ago with two pacifists against two, I think these two were Catholics. I know Peter Craft was one of them. So they were both Catholics. And I was listening to some of the things that the pacifists were saying. When it came to, okay, they're going to attack your daughter, I'm not going to do anything. And these people, they weren't wackos. I mean, they had prominent positions. This was up in Faneuil Hall, in historic Faneuil Hall in Boston. And I thought, I'm not that person. No. I want to be set apart. But somebody's going after Maureen, or Kevin, and I know the three of you are the same way. This is our challenge, though. We got to be different. We got to be set apart. Go.
I do believe we have definitive leadership, and it is Jesus. It's definitely Christ, and not so much that we're called to be different. We're called to be the same, called to be Christ. We're called to be until Christ be formed in you. And you're right, it is a call to holiness. I don't really understand your cautionary note. You kind of jumped in and said, "Hey, I want to," as if heaven wasn't the goal, or that we're trying to strive for something intensely more here. But the answer is the same, Tom, as it's ever been. It's the sacramental life. It's loving God and neighbor and getting busy doing that. I mean, the ascension into heaven is a real thing. It's the second glorious mystery, right? I mean,
what about the non-Catholics? You say this is your default position. You're like Jim and Dan with
my Catholic position.
Right. But I always say to you,
of course, it's my default position.
In defense of the billions who are not Catholic and have never learned anything about the sacraments, living the sacramental life.
There's the task, right? I mean, there's the intention to share the good news, that there is some good news, and that the sacraments are indeed for everybody, and all are indeed invited to experience that. I mean, that's the whole intention of EWTN. 425 million homes receive the Catholic Mass every day.
8 billion people. So
every continent, yeah.
No, what I'm saying, we have 8 billion people on the planet. So.
Oh, I haven't counted.
Point is always
but I'll take your word for it, though.
You and I go back and forth about this.
Sure.
That your default is, okay, it's the sacrament, and I'm saying, sorry, it's not everybody has access to the sacraments. Not everybody knows about the sacraments. They're brought up in a totally different culture. There's only so much we can do in my little part of the world. I know it is for the three of you as well. We all have our limit, and that's in our geographical limit. Wherever we live, how do we live? And Chris, and the difference, Deacon Chuck, was that we're not of the world, and that's what Jesus tells us. You're in the world, but you're not of the world, and that's my point about the difference and about holiness being set apart. We want to be set apart. Too often we don't set ourselves apart.
I agree. I think that's a fair statement, and that's the challenge.
Is it easier for you than it is for the three of us because you work at EWTN?
I'd say no.
Can you guess? Your guess is no.
No, I'm sure that the challenge is everybody has their own challenge, right? I mean, we all have our past and our future. But the goal is always the same, and to open our hearts so that God can pour out His mercy, and that He says it's actually ours. It's owed to us. He talked to Saint Faustina, and he said, actually, the greater the sinner, the more right he has to my mercy. So
That's the
this is
Fatima prayer. That's the
absolutely,
Fatima prayer, especially those in most need of my mercy.
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so that's anybody around the world.
What's your point?
My point is that there's no separation. We can't be. You're starting to sound like the Pharisees and the scribes, where it's only their group. And I could read you literally chapter and verse. And this is what Jesus came to change, because the Pharisees and the scribes were saying, not only those in our group. That was a very limited group.
I guess the real question is, did Jesus start the Catholic Church? Yes or no? Of course he did.
I'm not sure how that responds to my
Well,
comment.
whether it's important or not. Is it important to be Catholic or not? Have you found something in the Catholic Church that you think is important?
That's a straw man. I didn't say it's not important to be Catholic.
Mhm.
I'm talking about those who are not in the world that you're in.
Mhm.
And the three of us, the four of us are in, but definitely you.
Right.
Actually, definitely Dan too, because Dan works in a Catholic school. So,
But our job as Catholics is to go into the fray, to
Sure.
go down range, and to evangelize.
sure.
And
And
I don't grieve the salvation of anyone. There's nobody outside of God's mercy that, it couldn't at the last minute cry out,
Well, even if it's not the
mercy.
last minute, the Catechism
Right.
itself says you cannot limit the grace of Christ. It can go everywhere. We don't
Sure.
want to be Pharisaical and say only those in our group.
I don't think I've ever said that.
no, I don't think anybody in this
I
group
don't,
here relates to what you
yeah.
refer to as the Pharisees being a tight, non-inclusive group.
Oh.
As Catholic Christians, we're anything but that.
Oh,
We
Yes.
I was
we have
talking.
we
Well,
mobilize our feet to evangelize.
Sure.
He's on
Universal.
telephones, and he's in the greatest media for evangelization in the world.
right.
And you're
Same.
evangelizing. You're in men's groups, and you do what you need to do. There's nothing exclusive about us as Catholics.
It is
We are
exclusive.
practicing what you're saying is
It
out
is
there waiting for
exclusive.
us.
It is
Go ahead.
exclusive. It's got a Catholic audience. You have a Catholic audience. When I'm in my do my
It's not,
ministry, that's a Catholic audience.
that's not
I'm
so.
not I'm not diminishing that.
No,
I'm
there are many conversion stories, many people who
I'm
are not
sure. Yeah.
Catholic that have come across EWTN, whether it's through our shortwave radio,
let's say there's
souls.
a million. Let's
Hmm?
say there's a million, Deacon Chuck. My point in responding to you was, as it is many times when you and I've had this back and forth, is the salvation of those who are not Catholic, of which there are far more in the world than are not than are Catholic. So I'm talking about, not saying we shouldn't evangelize them, but people are dying right now who haven't been evangelized. 10 minutes ago, people died. Probably, well, not probably, thousands, maybe tens of hundreds, I don't know.
Sure.
But they've not been sacramentalized. They haven't been evangelized. So my point is, yeah, I would love the whole world to be Catholic, but I think it's wrong. And I have no doubt that I can back it up. Whether you guys accept it or not, that's not up to me. But that Christ's grace is as perfect for them as it is for us. We can't limit God. So the comparison with the Pharisees and the scribes is saying, they were saying, well, if you're not part of our group,
Right.
it's sorry, you're not going to be the same, and you're not going to have the riches of, if for those, they didn't always believe in an afterlife, but eventually they did. And certainly, thy kingdom come on earth. If you were not in that group, there's a teaching in the Talmud, which is an explanation of the Torah. You are not supposed to save a Gentile. So this is what Jesus was up against. This is one of the main points, or a big part of his sermon. You've heard it said. So that's my point. I wasn't saying that it's not important to evangelize. Of course it is. I'm in defense of those people who haven't been and won't be evangelized.
Yeah, and praying for them is a great thing to do and to continue to evangelize, but know that the fullness of truth subsists within the Catholic Church.
All right. We're getting close to the end, aren't we? The end of the
End of what? I think you're right.
All right. A pleasure as always. Gosh, see, this is a beautiful skirmish. The arguing upward, arguing to the king,
toward heaven. Right, Tom?
the kingdom of God. Yeah.
There you go.
Check the New Testament.
Do this again real soon.
All right, Danny. What is coming up next, if you can remember?
Always. Let me stay tuned, folks, for the Angelus and your prayer intentions with our good friend Peter and Jemmy.
WQPHradio.org. We thank our special guest stars, Deacon Chuck Kelly.
Good being with you.
Jim Mulvihill. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Thanks, Gene. Thanks, James, Tom, and the rest of the crew. Thank you, friends, for your support of this great station. God bless you.
Good night, guys. Be
God
well.
bless you all. God bless you
well.
guys.
Thank you for listening to the 13th Apostle with Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey. For more information on Dan, visit his website at www.danduddy.com or email dcduddy@gmail.com. Tom's website is faithpilgrims.com or email trcaffrey@faithpilgrims.com. How about you? Will you be the 13th Apostle?